Welcome to part 2 of Conversation and Wine. In this series of videos, I just drink wine and talk for about 30 odd minutes without the slightest structure to the whole thing. This wine that I'm drinking today is a Malbec and it's called Los Haroldos Roble and it's from Argentina. And from what I can remember, it's rather tasty. Now I'm just pouring it and I will commence talking. What I'm going to start talking about is Margaret Thatcher. Obviously, I'm not a fan of Margaret Thatcher, and I think people have good reason to feel aggrieved about the whole stint as Prime Minister. Obviously, you have the two main things about it that people don't like is the unemployment. So you had 3.3 million people unemployed, the longest rate of unemployment since the Great Depression, and obviously the deindustrialization of Britain. Obviously, you lose all the great industries. She let it all die. Basically, obviously the same companies like British Leyland's, Ferranti, they were on the last legs by the 1970s, but basically she let them die. So those two main things about people don't like about Thatcher is the deindustrialization and the unemployment. However, when people say, "Oh, Margaret Thatcher, the witch," and all that, she did do some things that needed to be done. Like, for example, basically, I'm going to go back to the 60s, and you had the Conservative government in 64 left a really big balance of payments deficit, where Britain was basically importing a lot more than it was exporting. So the Labour government came into 64 with the balance of payments deficit, and which meant that the pound was overvalued. So they kept saying they weren't going to devalue the pound until they did. And they had to devalue it by a lot more than they would have done if they had devalued it earlier. So when that happened, when they devalued the pound, what that meant was that they could increase exports more because British goods were cheaper to buy. So they increased exports, but what it meant was that they had to pay more for imports, so that increased inflation. So by the time of 1970, inflation was getting up to 10%, and Edward Heath, in his campaign in that general election, emphasised getting inflation down. And then that's what I was going to talk about, was what became prevalent in the 70s and the 60s. It started in the 60s, but they kept doing it in the 70s, was this thing called prices and incomes policy, which is like how you can, like, they had these national boards and they would set prices and wages for everything. And when people say Margaret Thatcher, the witch, and all that, people who say that don't want to have, from what I can see, they don't want to have these national boards that sit down and say, we're going to set this at this certain price, we're going to set wages at this certain price for these people, set prices for. They don't want that level of intervention in the economy. And I think that after the 70s, there was definitely a case for liberalising the economy and for having more of a free market and not having all these interventions in the economy. There's often a case for intervening in the economy, but intervening and setting all the prices in the economy and intervening to set all the wages in the economy, it's crazy. And it was back then, it was centrist, because like politicians like Edward Heath, Harold Wilson, and James Callaghan had lived through the 1930s, and their main worry was unemployment. They saw what unemployment did. They lived through it in the 30s. And for them, the main issue was full employment. That's what governments set themselves out to do. after the Second World War was to attain full employment, even if it meant intervening in the economy, even like demand management, all that Keynesian stuff, to keep employment up. They thought that if it meant inflating the economy to keep employment up, they'd do it. But at the same time, there was definitely a need after the 1970s. That if they kept persisting with this incomes policy, even if it didn't work, even if inflation kept going up, they kept persisting with it. So I think there was definitely a need for like a free market after the 1970s, and not have government or these national boards setting prices and setting wages. Obviously, after years 72, Heath reversed his decision and decided to go back to a prices and income policy, which Labour and opposition opposed because they in opposition they went more to the left, and a lot of the Labour politicians took the side of the trade unions, saying no, we don't want to freeze wages, we don't want, and then he had this push for growth, dash for growth, and that was kind of inflationary because it meant reflating the economy and printing money. And then obviously you had all the trade union disputes, which got exacerbated with the oil crisis, which affected the entire Western world. With the oil crisis, obviously that led to a spike in prices, but it affected Britain a lot more than other Western countries. And anyway, coal was getting more expensive to mine anyway, so they had to start rationing. He decided to start rationing electricity and rationing coal. And obviously you get the strikes back then. Then Labour came in, and they narrowly won the first 74 election, even though they got a slightly bit less of the popular vote. It was kind of like a draw really, and they got 3 more seats. Then Wilson called another election in October 74 and got a majority of 3 seats. And he basically inflation was getting worse because what Labour did, they said, we'll get the workers, the miners back to work by putting their wages up, which exacerbated inflation because it just led to wage inflation. And then 75, it reached the peak, post-war peak of about 30. I've seen it. Sometimes people say it was 30%, but I've also seen it as like 27% in other figures, or other people have said. And then you had 2 recessions in 1 year in 75. And then he brought back prices and incomes policy. Then 76, when Wilson left and buggered off, and Callaghan took over. Interest rates were about 15%. Inflation was 20 something percent, and obviously that was pricing Britain out of world markets because you can't borrow at that. When interest is that high, you can't. Investors don't want to borrow when inflation is that high, and when prices are that high, they don't want to buy your stuff. So investors lost trust in confidence in sterling, and we had to take a really huge loan from the IMF, and basically that meant a lot of spending cuts, a lot of spending cuts, which a lot of the Labour Party opposed, and a lot of the trade unionists opposed, things did improve a bit for 2 years after that, and you got inflation down to single digits by 1978. Unemployment was higher than it had been prior to, after the 40s, 50s, 60s, unemployment was going up by the 70s, but basically the situation was improving, and but by late 78, Callaghan had a small lead in the opinion polls, but he thought he'd give it another year to let the economy improve a bit more, so that he'd be in a better position by the next general election. And then he just have a bit of the wine. A lot of the spending cuts meant that they had to freeze wages for all public sector workers. So that after 78, you're getting more industrial unrest because they basically this led to what was called as the Winter of Discontent, where all public sector workers went on strike, hospitals went on strike, funeral people went on strike, the rubbish went uncollected. You had rubbish all over the streets. People couldn't get treatment in hospitals. Dead people were left on the streets to die. It's chaos. And then Thatcher won by I don't think 79 was a landslide, but she did win by a majority of something like 40 something seats. I think 83 was definitely a landslide. But basically what I'm saying is it was definitely after the 70s there was definitely a need for union reform, trade union reform, and basically liberalising the economy and having more of a free market. But then Thatcher, with her sadomonetrism, as Dennis Eden called it, went too much the other way, and basically 3.3 million unemployed. That's obviously she just let British industry, which was on its last legs already due to industrial unrest and high inflation and the oil crisis, she just let it die. Basically, what I'm saying is, there's definitely a case against not liking Margaret Thatcher, but at the same time, all those people who say the witch is dead and all that, I'm sure most of them don't want these national boards that set prices and wages for the entire economy. And it didn't work back then anyway, but most people who say those things don't want that. They don't want that. So that's a few thoughts on Margaret Thatcher. And now I'm going to talk about Bismarck, another politician, another leader, famous leader. Basically, he was leader of Prussia and leader of the first republic, the first installment of the, first leader of Germany. As Prussian leader, he had these three wars. He had a war against Austria, a war against Denmark, and a war against France. When he was minister-president of Prussia, and he wanted all control of foreign policy decisions as well, which is basically the liberals. He had to negotiate a lot with the liberals, who didn't like the fact that he concentrated so much power into himself, taking all these foreign policy decisions. And basically, also it was different. He didn't really deal with the parliament. A lot of it was like a lot of what he did was like these executive orders, and Parliament would debate itself, and he would sit on a chair and just watch them. That's how it worked back then. And war with Austria, because there was these territorial disputes between Austria and Denmark, and he won both of those wars. But basically, Austria were kind of weak back then, and he attacked them. But the thing about the war with France was the Franco-Prussian War. He did that so as to get the Catholics in the south of Germany, Cologne, all that, on his side, to rail them against the French. So that would lead to a unified Germany, which is indeed what happened. But then the other then he had to deal with. He didn't like the liberals. He didn't like. He basically didn't like their laissez-faire approach to the economy, and he didn't like. You have to deal with social democrats, and he even he made the social democrats illegal for about 2 or 3 years. But basically, another great policy achievement by Bismarck is he created the first welfare state in the entire world. So, basically due to industrialization, there was a lot of poverty and a lot of insecurity, and there was definitely a need for a. That's what led to the need for welfare states was due to the industrialization of society and to the insecurity that it created. And he created the first system of unemployment insurance. He created the first sick and injury insurance, injury insurance. He created the first state pensions. He created the first healthcare insurance, and this was all done around around the 1880s. But there was two reasons why he did it. The first reason was that the threat of socialism, because if the conservatives and the Junkers, whatever you want to call it, the Prussian Junkers and the conservatives, if they adopted these measures, then that meant that it vanquished the threat of socialism, because they gave these security to these workers, and they wouldn't turn to socialism. The other reason why he did it was because he genuinely believed in it. He did think that it was necessary to have these to have it. Then after he wasn't like he definitely was interested in peace for his belligerence against Denmark, Austria, and France, and this was on the whole a period of peace. And Bismarck's after the Napoleonic Wars, this was on the whole a period and maybe that the revolutions of 1848 were interrupted that for a bit, but then Bismarck's wars were definitely not the norm. But he definitely was more interested in peace, and he signed these peace treaties with just before he left office and before William II took over. He signed all these peace treaties, which William II he meddled with a lot of that, and that did a lot, and overturning a lot of the peace treaties that Bismarck signed in the early 1890s. That was one of the catalysts for the First World War. Alright, so that's enough on Bismarck. And now I'm going to talk about... I talked about liberalism a bit in the previous video. So basically, what are the... It's such a diffuse ideology, but one of the four main principles is that it's individualistic, it's egalitarian, it's melioristic, and it's universal. It's individualistic in that it believes in the privacy of the individual as opposed to him being part of a collective. It is egalitarian and it believes in the equal worth of each individual, and that everyone deserves to be treated equally. Third, it is melioristic in that it believes in progress, and that progress and development are the natural state of mankind. And fourth, it is universal. It believes these principles apply to everyone, regardless of the nationality or any kind of tribe or allegiances or nationalities. And there's other definitions of liberalism that I've seen. It believes in liberty, and that each individual has the right to pursue his life in the way that he wants to lead it. Secondly, it is believes in property rights. And thirdly, property rights, liberty, and hang on, I'll just have a bit of a wind before I remember the third principle of that definition. Liberty, property rights, that these principles are universal. But it's so diffuse because obviously you get it. There is one of the other tenets of liberalism is a distrust of the state and the abuse of state power and authoritarianism. But it's so diffuse because on the other hand you get people like Milton Friedman and Hayek calling themselves liberals, but then you get William Beveridge and John Maynard Keynes calling themselves liberals. It's a very diffuse, diverse ideology, but on the whole I think if you told them everything that I just listed then, Keynes, Beveridge, Milton Friedman, Hayek, even though in many ways people see all those guys, they see Keynes and Beveridge and they see Milton Friedman and Hayek as being on the opposite sides of the political spectrum, but they would agree with everything I just listed then. But at the same time, it's a very diffuse ideology because William Beveridge obviously laid the foundations for the welfare state, for the British welfare state. He wrote the Beveridge Report, which sold thousands of copies, and that was basically the foundation for the Clement Attlee government of 1945-51. John Maynard Keynes had all these theories about full employment, demand management in the economy to boost the demand up when it goes down, so as to keep full employment. And for those reasons, a lot of people say that Keynes wasn't even liberal because he stressed so much intervention within the economy that they wouldn't make him a liberal. Nonetheless, he called himself a liberal. So, but then Keynes and Beveridge were the two main, political theorists that the Labour Party turned to after the Second World War. Have a bit more of the wine. But as I said, it's very diffuse. You get John Rawls as a liberal, but Robert Nozick's a liberal. As I said, Friedman, Hayek. But then, as I said, everything that I listed just then, all those principles, I think Milton Friedman would agree with those principles, and so would John Maynard Keynes. Hayek would agree with those principles, but so would William Beveridge. Alright, well, that's enough on liberalism. Lastly, I will talk about British cinema, because obviously, when you think about European cinema, people will usually think about French cinema, German cinema, maybe even Scandinavian cinema, maybe Russian cinema. British cinema. There's this famous quote, really snotty quote from Jean-Luc Godard, who obviously made some really insufferable, pretentious films. Made some films that I enjoy, but on the whole, I'm a big Jean-Luc Godard fan. He had this quote that said that you could only lose hope in British cinema if you believed in it in the first place. But then, especially like the 40s, where that quote is a lot of rubbish because there's been some brilliant, really good British films made. Especially like the golden period was the 1940s, like Michael Powell, Emmerich Pressburger. I think there's a quote from someone who listed the three main British film directors are Alfred Hitchcock, David Lean, and Michael Powell. But then Alfred Hitchcock doesn't really count because he made most of his films in Hollywood in the States, so he basically made American films. Initially, he started his career in Britain, but basically I would class him as more of an American filmmaker. But basically, there's Michael Powell and his partnership with Emmerich Pressburger, who's a Hungarian guy, incidentally. But and then David Lean said those two guys, and then obviously you got the Ealing Studio films, which are very good. The Lady Killers, Passport to Pimlico, Kind Hearts and Coronets, brilliant films, very funny films. But for me, the best was definitely Powell Pressburger. They made astonishing films. One of my favourite films of all time is Matter of Life and Death. You just watch that and you think to yourself, bloody hell, they made that in the 40s. You couldn't really make that now even. It's just astonishing scenes how they recreate this. Basically, that film originated out of two ideas. It originated out of a request made by the British government to Michael Powell that there were strained relationships between the Brits and the Americans. And the government wanted Michael Powell to make a film to help relationships. And there's a scene in heaven. That's just one part of the film, though. But there's a scene in heaven where you get this court scene, and there's a debate as to which country is the best defender of individual rights. The UK, obviously the birthplace of liberty, or is it the Americans? And Black Narcissus, and the other reason why I made that film is that Michael Powell saw that a pilot fell out of a plane, and he fell out of a really high, a certain height, and he survived. And basically, the plot of the film is a character played by David Niven is in a cockpit, and he throws himself out of the plane. And he survives, but then he has this hallucination that there's this heaven wants him to go to heaven because there's been a glitch in the system, and he survived. And basically, he's met this American this American woman, and he's besotted by her, and he wants to be with her, but heaven wants him to go to heaven. But the scenes of heaven are brilliant, and the scenes in Earth are brilliant. Earth is shot in color, and heaven is shot in black and white, which is obviously a reversal of Wizard of Oz. Black Narcissus is a brilliant film. What else? Black Narcissus. The Red Shoes. So many great films, and they were all made in the 1940s. 49th Parallel is really good. So many great films he made. That duo made. The other one is Life and Death of Colonel Blimp. That's a really good film. I Know Where I'm Going. They're so brilliant, and they're quintessentially British as well. They're easily one of my favorite directors, and easily one of the best directors of all. You could make the contention that one of the best directors of all time. Martin Scorsese cites them as a big influence. So it's just like when Godard, the snotty guy, made that quote, said that, it's like, but look at Powell and Pressburger. Surely that's just saying that's a refutation that British cinema, there's no hope in it. Just saying those, just mentioning the names Michael Powell, Emmerich Pressburger, that in itself is a refutation that there's no hope in British cinema. Then David Lean's a really good director, because if you watch some of the early Powell Pressburger films, he appears as an editor in those films, and then he became a director in his own right. Brief Encounter, that's a film about an illicit relationship. Obviously at the time that was quite a controversial topic. it was harder to get a divorce back then, and it was obviously socially it was more frowned upon, but that's a really good film. Bridge Over the River Kwai, that's brilliant film. I'm not going to tell you the ending, but watch it to the end. The ending is brilliant. Basically, these British soldiers are being captured by the Japanese, and the Japanese treat them brutally, and they have to build this bridge. And initially, the British soldiers oppose them, but then they end up building the bridge together. It's a really good film. Hobson's Choice, that explores issues about gender and class, which obviously at the time were more prevalent. Those we talk about those issues today, but they were really maybe more prevalent back then. Lawrence of Arabia, that's got some stunning scenes, desert, and the music. Yeah, that's a really good film. So yeah, David Lean and Powell Pressburger in themselves are refutations of Godard's poncy statement that there's no hope in British cinema. There's also, like, later on, Lindsay Anderson and Mike Leigh. They're good filmmakers as well. Well, thank you for joining me. I've talked about everything I want to talk about. And stay tuned for Conversation on Wine Part 3, which will appear in 2 weeks' time.